I decided that I would finish up the material on chapter 25. This material can be a little bit difficult and tricky. I can't really cover everything. So the material that we're going to cover in this video is one that's going to be extra credit on the exam. So 2 points if I give you a question like this and you answer it correctly, you can pick up a little bit of extra credit on the exam. But if you find this too difficult, don't sweat it. You can always pick this up, later on. And the main point is at the very last slide, which you'll see when we get there. If we go all the way back to chapter 1, they talked about the idea of models. And a model is just a simple way of representing what goes on in the economy. And a very simple model is something called the circular flow. The idea here is that firms, businesses, pay workers money, and workers in return give firms their labor services. Ohio Wesleyan pays me money, and in return, I teach their classes. Okay, so that's one part of the circular flow. We also see that firms provide goods and services to households, that means to people, lawyers, doctors. I had some nice jam for breakfast today. Bought that from a firm. So goods and services are supplied to households, and households pay for those goods and services. When we went to Kroger's and got that nice jelly, they didn't give it to us for free. So what we see here is that on the outer circle, firms are giving goods and services to individuals, and in return individuals give them work. And in the inner circle, firms are paying people money, and people are using that money to buy goods and services. This is something we're going to come back to. Now, suppose the government decides what they want to do is they want to inject some money into the economy. We looked at it before and we said, well, suppose aggregate demand is too low. And New York City, if you've ever flown into Newark or Kennedy or JFK, Kennedy or LaGuardia, you know that some of the airports certainly can need to be upgraded. I've been in China, and actually some of the airports in China are better than the ones we have in the United States. So let's say the government spends money. They hire contracting firms in New York City to build an airport. They pay firms to build an airport. Well, let us say initially, what we find out is aggregate demand, which in equilibrium is going to give us real GDP. Suppose consumption's 900, investment's 200, government spending is 250, and we'll say exports equal imports, keeps the math a little bit more simple. So if consumption and investment is 900 plus 200, 1100, plus 250, it's 1350. Well, now the government has spent money to expand the airport, maybe build a new airport in New York. So the result is now we have 900 plus 200, but not 250, 260. What we see is government spending has gone up. It might be because there's a need, or what we saw in 2009 with the acts being passed to stimulate the economy during the Great Recession. The government was building roads in part to stimulate the economy. For those of you from Northeast Ohio, prior to 2009, it was two lanes on I-71 from Cleveland to Columbus. But they used the money from that stimulus package in 2009 to add a third lane, and now it's 3 lanes all the way, or pretty much all the way, I believe, from Columbus up to Cleveland. So now what we see is government spending has gone up when the airport was built. Well, wait a second. So it's now 900 plus 200 plus 260. The government spent money on the airport. And as a result, GDP has gone up. Well, but the point of today's video is the fact that the impact's going to be greater than just 10. Let's see what happens. So when the government decides that they're going to expand or build an airport in New York City, they give the money to the firms. We'll keep it nice and simple. And let's say this 10 or 10 billion, the firms pay it all out to workers. Keep it nice and simple. We won't worry about profits, supplies, whatever. But they just hire people to work on the new airport, and they pay the workers 10. So now the firm hires the workers, and they have more money. Great. So this being New York, one of the things the workers can say is, hey, great, we have more money. Let's go spend it on pizza. Pizza's pretty good in New York. So income goes, the government spends money. They spend money with firms. They spend 10. The firms give that 10 to the workers, and the workers find their income has gone up by 10. Okay. Well, now, remember we talked about that idea in the previous video of the marginal propensity to consume, the share of each additional dollar of income that you could consume? So these workers, their household income is up by 10. The government has paid the firms to build the airport. The firms paid the workers 10. If, and we'll make this assumption, we'll keep it nice and simple, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, that means people spend 80% of each additional dollar of income. So consumption on pizza rises by 8. So it's 0.8 times 10. In other words, income went up by 10. They consume 80% of it. That's 8. That's where we get this 8. Consumption goes up by 8. So now the government spent money. That raised GDP. But when the money gets distributed to the workers, they go out and spend it on pizza. Well, what's the result? Wait a second. 908, consumption's up. Investment will keep this constant in this simple example. And government spending goes up to, has gone up to 260. Well, now if we add it up, it's 1368. What we've seen is the initial $10 billion results in $18 billion in GDP. Hey, great. GDP has gone up. The workers have gone out and bought pizza. But wait a second. When the workers go out and buy pizza, the pizza firms now have more money. They pay their workers. If workers spent $8 billion on pizza, maybe they go out and buy New York bagels, almost as good as Detroit bagels. But anyway, so now the government spends money on an airport. The workers get the money. They buy pizza. The pizza firms, get the money. They pay their workers, and the people that are working at the pizza places, they go out and buy bagels. Well, wait a second. So now, since GDP rose by 8 from the last iteration, the last time around, what we now see is that the consumption will go up because of the bagels by the bagel workers. They now have more money because they got paid, and their income has gone up by 8. Whoops. And they spend 80% of the 8, or 6.4. Well, wait a second. This goes on again and again and again. Where will it all end? Where does it all stop? What is going to be the final impact on GDP and consumption? Well, there's a formula that we can use. It's a two-step formula. As they like to say in the movies, here's where we cut to the chase. Here's where we see what's going on. It's a two-step formula. It's a mathematical formula. It's called an infinite series. I am not going to prove it. The videos I make have a limit of 15 minutes. I could not prove this mathematically in 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is cut to the chase. I'm going to give you the result. There is something called the multiplier. We'll see in the next slide how we use the multiplier. Numerically, the multiplier, the formula for the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, the share of each additional dollar that people spend on consumption. So in today's example, if the MPC was 0.8, if people spent 80 cents of each additional dollar, this thing, which I have not yet defined, called the multiplier, will be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8. That's 1 minus 0.8, that's 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2, how many times does 20 cents go into a dollar? That's 5. So the first thing we've done is we discovered this thing called the multiplier. It's equal to 5. Now, here's the key. The change in GDP will be equal to the multiplier that we just calculated, 5, times the initial change in government spending. In other words, if the multiplier is 5 and the government spends $10 billion on an airport, When all is said and done, the change in GDP will be 5 times the initial spending of 10, it's 50. When all is said and done, GDP will rise by 50. This idea of the multiplier, it shows us what the final effect will be. The change in GDP is the multiplier times the initial change. The formula for the multiplier, we calculated, it depends on the marginal propensity to consume, was 5. The government spent 10. The change in GDP is 50. So if originally it was 1350, the change in GDP is 50, we'll now have 1350 plus 50, GDP is 1400. Well, we had said government spending had gone up by 10, so it's now 260. Well, you notice this doesn't add up. 900 plus 200 is 1100 plus 260 is 1360. It's not 1400. Well, what happens? GDP, remember that circular flow, what's produced generates income. If GDP goes up by 50 and people consume 80% of that, 80% of 50 is 40. So it will go up by 40. What we see here is now 940 plus 200 is 1140 plus 260 is 1400. And by the way, if you didn't follow that last step, you know what? If we know that 200 plus 260 plus something is 1400, the only thing that's going to make that all add up is 940. You can do it either way. It's going to work. But one of the things I always like to say when I look at economics is what's the so what? What do we really get out of this? Now, one thing that we really get out of this, we can use little algebraic models to show what's going on in the economy. This is a very simple macroeconomic model. As you go on, you take more coursework in economics, they'll make more elaborate, more realistic models. But the key point to all this is the multiplier is powerful. What we see here is when the government spends $10 billion on an airport, when the money goes to the people and they spend it on goods and the firms get those goods and they pay their workers and those workers spend it on goods, it's a ripple effect. And the point that we're trying to make here is that $10 of government spending can have a much larger effect than 10 on GDP. It's really powerful. That's the idea of the multiplier. This is nothing new. They know about it in Washington, D.C., but the idea here is government spending has a ripple effect. This also applies to tax cuts. If we cut taxes and people, if there's a tax cut and people go out and buy cars, then the auto workers have more money. They'll go out, and they'll buy, spaghetti dinners, and the people that make spaghetti, they'll have more money, and again and again. Now, sometimes people save the money. Sometimes taxes take part of the money. Sometimes people spend it on imports. Various things happen. In the real world, on that other side of the windows, the actual multiplier is probably somewhere, it depends on the time, the various factors can influence it. Where we are in the business cycle is one of them, but the actual multiplier is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 3.0. So just thought I'd make that. I know some of the math here is a little bit messy, so I thought I would make this extra credit. So for those of you that stayed till the end, hope you got something out of this. Take care, and we'll be back with more videos soon.